Alright, this is a short video on fashion photography, and this time I'm going to actually try and keep it short. We're going to be looking at 6 of the key concepts or ideas, principles that relate to fashion photography. Fashion photography captures models, apparel and accessories for the fashion industry. These photos are used for marketing and branding purposes. Fashion photography is as much about selling a lifestyle as it is an item of clothing. Therefore, a story needs to be told in the image. So fashion photography is essentially, for the most part, portrait photography, but as portrait photography, instead of telling the story of that person, it's telling the story of that item of clothing. So if it's a summer dress, then that photograph's not going to be taken on a windy, cold winter's day. The photo is going to be taken when the sun is out. The person's going to be at the beach. They're going to be smiling. They're going to be having fun because they're selling a lifestyle to the viewer. And that lifestyle is you wear this summer dress and you go around in summer and you live this lifestyle. So as a fashion photographer, your goal is not just to take a pretty picture of a garment. A garment is an item of clothing, but to create a narrative that appeals to the viewer. So that narrative is that story that you're selling, that lifestyle that you're trying to convince your viewer to buy this product because of the story that you're trying to tell them. So there are 6 key concepts, and the same as portrait photography, but just applied in a slightly different way. So depth of field, same with portrait photography, depth of field. If you use a large depth of field, you would be doing so because you have things in the background that you want to be kept in focus, like this image here where there's the cityscape in the background, which the photographer wanted you to be able to see, so they use a large depth of field so you can see what's going on in the background. But even in this case, when there is something interesting in the background, but you don't necessarily need it to be a prominent part of the image, the photographer has blurred that out using a shallower depth of field just to keep more of the focus on that subject. So this is probably a nicer way of going about it because you can still clearly see what's going on in the background. You don't need to have that large depth of field, but it creates that slight blurring effect in the background, helps to keep the focus and attention on the subject. So either or works, it depends on the scenario, but this would typically be a more favored approach. And then you can obviously go to the other end of the spectrum and have a really shallow depth of field where all of the focus is just on the person themselves, but you would only do that in the instance where you don't have elements or features of the background that you want to be kept in focus. Focal length, same with portraiture, and same with architecture, determines the perspective of the image. If you're up close to your subject, if you're using a wide angle lens, if you're coming down low, then you're going to create this sort of distorted perspective, versus if you're standing further back and you're using a longer focal length and you're zooming in, you're flattening the image and creating a more natural looking effect. So either or works, depends on the story you're trying to tell, the narrative you're trying to paint, the lifestyle you're trying to sell. It's about determining what works best for that story you're trying to tell. So a wider angle lens is going to give you this sort of effect where you can make buildings have those sharp angles in them, and standing further away and using a longer focal length, you're going to be able to create a flatter looking image like this one here. Lighting is the most important thing, I would say. Fashion photographers are masters of using studio lighting. So obviously when they're in the studio, they're masters of using those lighting options in the studio, but also they're masters of adapting those lighting techniques on location. And given that we might not necessarily have the access to that equipment or the knowledge on how to use them, there are ways that we can create similar sort of results using what's available to us. So for instance, the easiest way to go about it is to obviously use the natural light from the sun, and then to move your subject, position your subject in a way that creates a lighting effect that's appealing based on the position of the sun. So in this instance here, you've got the sun over in this back corner starting to set behind the buildings. The person, so your sun's coming from here and your person's standing behind that light. So when that light hits that person from behind and it trickles around, like hits that person from behind and trickles around, the light seeps around in front of their face, you get that effect there, that rim light effect, where the light's hitting from behind and just peeking around the corner there. And that can really be a useful technique to create some interesting halo and highlights on the edges of a person. So for instance, you get that here around their arms and along the side of their body. So that's one way of lighting a person, is positioning them in a way that the light is behind them to create that rim light around the edges of them. The same effect's been created here. Light has come from behind. You can see that rim light, that halo that's appearing on her hair. This photographer has obviously used a fill light as well. So what that means is they have light coming in from behind that lights up the back part of that person, that backlights that person. So they've got a rim light or another form of backlighting, and then they'll have another light in the front that shines a little bit of light on their face, so that this image here, how the person, while they've got a nice rim light, the face is dark. Whereas this image here, they've brought some more light in to shine on the person's face so that you can see the person's face as well. So obviously you do that ideally with studio lighting, but you can do it with other options as well. I mean, a real dodgy way of doing it is with the flash on the camera, or if you've got a light on your phone or a torch, you can do that. That's a really basic and easy way of doing it. Trying to see if I've got anything here. Another way of doing it is styrofoam. If you know what styrofoam is, when you buy something and you get those big white sheets of soft plasticky stuff that's meant to protect it inside the box. If you get like a big blank sheet of that, like a big white one, you could probably get it from a newsagent or something, or Bunnings or like a hardware store. Get a big sheet of that, probably cost you $3 or something, and that's a really good reflection of light. So you could hold that if the sun was coming towards me here, and I could hold that white styrofoam board, and I could use it to reflect the light. So the light hits it and reflects. So I could use it to, angle it in the way that I want it to reflect it towards my subject, which might be here. So the light comes in and I can reflect it towards that person. So if I've got the camera here taking a photo, and then I have a person here holding that styrofoam. So this is my subject, my camera's here, and someone's here holding a whiteboard, and the light is coming from this direction. So the light's coming from behind my subject. It's creating that rim light that wraps around their head, and then it's also hitting this styrofoam board and bouncing back onto their face. And that's how you create an effect like this one here. So light comes from behind, and then obviously you have to position the person that's holding the styrofoam so that they're out of view of the camera. But that's a simple way of going about it. So all this person, the photographer in this image, needed to do was just have that extra form of lighting reflected into, and you can use actual lighting reflectors. That silver thing in your parents' car that they put on the dashboard that folds up, you could even use that. Just something to reflect the light back into the person's face, or vice versa. This image here, I was going to say that they've got the light. You could essentially do that. Essentially, this isn't what's the case is here. They're definitely using studio lighting and reflectors and whatnot. But you could easily imagine that this image could just as easily be taken using natural light, with the sun shining directly into the subject's face, which isn't the best form of lighting, but it is definitely an option, just to make sure you've got as much light as possible in the scene. So lighting is a big key to fashion photography, and the best way to learn about it is just to watch more videos and learn more about it and experiment with things, and be creative, because yes, the professionals have professional equipment, you don't have professional equipment, so work out how other ways that you can create the same effect using things that are available to you at home. Location. So as I said, we're telling a story, we're selling a lifestyle, we're creating a narrative. So the location has to relate to the subject and the item of clothing or the fashion that we're trying to sell. So, you look at here, there's a connection between this sort of industrial steel, metal scene, and they're the same sort of tones and feeling that we get from this dress. It's industrial, it's metal, it's shiny, it's same. So there's a tie-in between the location and the subject. Same here. This one here, say for instance, subject is wearing an outfit that might be considered a bit more street or urban, that sort of like style of clothing. So then obviously they're not standing on a beach, they're standing in an urban setting or a street environment. So there's a connection between the subject and the location there. Same here, subject is dressed in a sophisticated way, looks very classy, and they're not sitting in some back street somewhere, they're not standing here, they're not standing here in a paddock, they're in a nice balcony overlooking some view in some fancy chair that looks like the kind of place that a sophisticated person would eat, a type of restaurant that a sophisticated person would eat at. They go here, they don't walk around the back streets here. So it's telling that narrative, creating that lifestyle. And same here, it's like a country sort of jacket, and we're here sitting in the field, and that's again, it's creating that connection between the subject and the item that you're trying to sell and the location that the photograph is taken in, so that the viewer can look at this and start to vision themselves being in that situation. It's about, as I said, selling that lifestyle so that the viewer looks at it and can vision themselves in that situation. And the second to last one is pose and expression. So you have to think about, same as portrait, how the person is posed and the expression on their face and how that relates to that story you're trying to tell. Are they marching through the streets because they're dressed in a way that says, is the story that they're going to seize the day and they're marching to work and they're dressed in this sort of way? Usually you won't see too many smiling faces in fashion photography. Usually you'll see very stern faces like this one here. Or are they posed in a way that accentuates, holding up the dress and allowing the wind to blow that dress in the background, So using posing as a way to emphasize that item of clothing, make it flow more. So pose and expression and how they can be used to contribute to that lifestyle that you're selling, that narrative you're creating, or how they can emphasize or accentuate that item of clothing. And finally, camera angle. So typically you've got the 3 camera angles: low camera angle, looking up at someone, making them look more powerful, or in this case, like a more powerful sort of thing. Typically looking from a high angle makes a person look more vulnerable, or from an eye level angle has a more natural feeling. So there's no right or wrong answer. They all just have different effects on the viewer, and it's about working out which one fits in best with that narrative you're creating. So those were the 6 key concepts. First was depth of field, knowing, do you want a shallow or a large depth of field? Do you want a wide or a long focal length, and how that affects the perspective? Ensure that you are using lighting to the best of your ability, and maximizing what is available to you and being creative with it. Choosing a location that is relevant to the story you're creating, making sure you're posing your subject and ensuring that the expression on their face is also appropriate and relevant, and choosing a camera angle that contributes another element of depth to that narrative that you're trying to create. So those are the 6 key concepts of fashion photography. Many of those concepts, as I've discussed in other videos, are relating to different fields. You would have noticed that all the things that we talked about in this tutorial are very similar to portrait photography. So feel free to watch that one for some overlap of information that might help you strengthen your knowledge of both. Otherwise, thank you for watching this video. Bye.